Hi, everyone. I think we'll start the event now. My name's Andrea Coomber, and it's my great privilege to be the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. We're now 1 week, very nearly, into a new government. And the purpose of this webinar is to talk about what Labor should be doing to solve what's happening in prisons. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by our Legal Director, Gemma Abbott, and our Campaigns Director, Andrew Nielsen, to have an initial discussion, at which stage we'd really invite questions and comments from people in the audience. As Katie's already put into the chat, please do introduce yourself. I know lots of you are. Thank you for that. In the chat box, please. Nikki's put a question in saying, can we see who's attending? I think if you press on participants, Nikki, you can see everybody who's participating, I think. So hopefully that's possible. If you have questions, please do put them into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. You put the questions into the chat box, we're not going to answer them. So chat box for comments and introductions, and Q&A box for questions. Gemma and Andrew and I will talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll invite questions, so get them in early. Gemma will talk, I'll speak about some general context. Gemma will talk to the immediate crisis. Andrew will speak about the report that came out yesterday, Grasping the Nettle, about what needs to be done about the immediate population crisis. And we're also going to share some views from our members in prison who are unfortunately unable to join us today because of access to the internet, about what the government should prioritise. Just to remind you that this is a taped event, and it will be circulated later to people who've been unable to attend. So do keep a mind on that. I mean, most people are on this call in this spotlight event are members of the Howard League, so you would know from your communications from us and your general interest, and in many cases your work yourselves, that we have prisons that are now in crisis. The Prime Minister overnight has said he'd not appreciated to the extent of the crisis, and I'm sure that is true, because it is a kind of an unimaginably bad situation that we now find ourselves in with respect to crisis to the prison system. I have to say that is not through any lack of us raising every alarm bell and pushing every button we have been trying to do with Labor, but also with the previous government over the last kind of 12 months. About a year ago, around this time, we did write to the then Secretary of State for Justice suggesting 8 things that were with his immediate power to be able to address. And at the time, we're told that they would just be building more prisons. A lot of those recommendations, I have to say, subsequently, they have picked up through desperation, but there we go. So the immediate crisis is that as of last Friday, we have had 87,453 people in our prison system, very nearly the 88,000 historic high. We had, before the election, the Prison Governors Association a warning that the entire criminal justice system stood on the precipice of failure, and that would, within weeks, put the public at risk. And we know that this is not a short-term problem. You know, the latest population projections estimate an increase by more than 30%, up to 114,800 people in the next 4 years. And we've already had the new Prime Minister recognise that it's simply not going to be possible to build prison places quick enough to respond. If that was a solution at all, and obviously we don't think it is, it wouldn't be possible to do that. So the result is that prisons have and continue to be horrendously overcrowded unless the government takes steps urgently. And obviously in the last few days, those sort of steps have been foreshadowed in various quarters. This isn't a short-term problem. We need to alleviate overcrowding, yes, but we also need to address the myriad of other ways in which the prison system harms people who come into contact with it and makes our communities less rather than more safe. So whilst it's tempting to focus on, as the new government inevitably is going to have to, on the immediate population crisis, We also need this government to think about other pressing issues. One of them is the ongoing and urgent plight of IPP prisoners. You will have seen perhaps articles in the newspaper today, some comms that we've been involved in with partner organisations to highlight the ongoing disaster that is the IPP. And we do have nearly 3,000 people still in prison on IPP sentences. We have thousands of people in the community who have the possibility of recall hanging over their heads without sufficient support. We have concerns about the issue of ongoing joint enterprise convictions, and specifically the injustice of murder convictions of secondary parties, people who didn't play a meaningful role in committing offences. I was at a Category C prison yesterday with a group of men convicted as secondary parties of joint enterprise murder, who were serving 25, 30 years, having not been present at the time the person was killed, having not meaningfully, in some cases, contributed at all to the actual offence. And it is a racial injustice as much as anything else, because those people are overwhelmingly young Black men. We're concerned about the overuse of remand, and it's perhaps been a little surprising that that's not something that's been picked up much in the last week, and we could perhaps talk about that. And then the unrelenting inflation of sentence lengths, which is why we find ourselves in this position. So because people are increasingly just going into prison and not coming out when historically they would have come out after a certain period of time. They're just staying in. So we need to tackle the consequences of all of these. We need to tackle the consequences of years of underinvestment in a dilapidated, in some cases, literally crumbling prison estate, the problems with staff shortages, staff capacity, meaning it's very hard to get people out of their cells, the profound sense of despair that plagues so many people in prison, including the people who look after them and the people who work with them. I'm always talking to prison governors and prison staff and prison professionals who are at their wits' end trying to keep people safely in conditions they know themselves that are indecent. People who are vulnerable, we've got record rates of self-harm and suicide. There's a complete lack of vision about what to do about children who are being looked after by the state, children who commit crime, and rising levels of violence, assaults and use of force. As I've mentioned, the racial disparity issue that blights the system and society more generally. So we have a lot to do, and we have obviously a new government, and tackling this crisis has to be a priority for them. I mean, it has to be a priority because of the dreadful state into which the government has inherited. And it has been, I have to say, I think most of us are quite pleased, happy, surprised that in his first press conference, the new Prime Minister talked about the fact that we have too many people in prison. He said, you know, we need to think about how we use prison. And yesterday said he was shocked by how poorly, how bad things had got. So these are all encouraging signs that there's going to be meaningful reform, honest conversation and candour about what prison can and can't achieve. And obviously an innovative appointment and very welcome appointment in James Timpson, the former chair of the Prison Reform Trust, and a committed supporter of penal reform as Prisons Minister. So I think it's fair to say that all three of us, at least, feel a lot more hopeful with a much more sense of possibility underlying the conversation today than perhaps it would have been a week ago, and certainly 2 months ago. So today's an opportunity to think about what the government's got to do and what they should be doing. And so I'll pass over to Gemma, who's our legal director, to talk about the immediate issues for the government.
Thank you, Andrea. I think before we can get too excited about the potential for sort of bold, radical, creative, meaningful penal reform, we do need to grapple with the reality of today's capacity crisis and ask what the government can do about that in the short term. The MOJ's own prison projections sort of provide several factors behind why we've got here, why we have a growing prison population, which include greater levels of prosecutorial activity, the court backlog, and changes in sentencing policy. And I think we know political interventions, they've distorted proportionality in sentencing, and most significantly, they've driven up sentence lengths. And the record numbers of people who are in custody on remand or have been recalled to custody are obviously not helping the situation. And at the same time, and sort of using the words of the previous Justice Select Committee, public debate on sentencing has been stuck in a dysfunctional and reactive cycle. And that's meant that public discourse and a desire for tough on crime rhetoric has often been divorced from the reality that we are sending more people to prison for longer than ever before. So what's the government going to do about it tomorrow or next week to deal with the fact we have prisons that are almost literally overflowing with people? So it seems that the end of custody supervised license scheme will likely continue in the very short term. So this was an emergency measure introduced by the previous government late last year, October last year, to allow some prisoners to be released up to 18 days prior to the release date that they would have otherwise had. And that was then increased to 60 days in March and up to 70 days in May. But by design, it could only ever be a short-term measure. You'd require a continual ramping up of that early release period for it to continue to make a difference. And although the scheme was a welcome step in so much as it did ease those population pressures, we know it's been insufficiently resourced. It's led to intolerable pressure on probation. We know people have been released to homelessness, and some are being recalled after release at short notice very quickly. So in terms of next steps, well, there's been a few ideas floated this week. It would be fair to say this section of the chat today has been written right up to the wire this morning. But today there seems to be only one idea left on the table, actually, which would replace the end of custody supervised license scheme. And that's an idea that we and others, including the Prison Governors Association, have proposed, which is that the point of automatic early release for standard determinate sentences should be moved to 40% of the way through the sentence. I heard Alex Chalk talking on the Day Today programme calling that SDS 40, which I must confess is not an expression I've heard yet, but I'm imagining that's going to take off. So SDS 40 is what we're calling it. And we would support this measure as an emergency response. I think it would be a more conclusive and fair approach than the end of custody supervised license scheme, which has really lacked transparency and consistency, which has made planning for individuals and for services very difficult. There have been other balloons sent up since the election result. Doesn't seem today that either of these ideas will make it into the King's speech next week, but some interesting ideas. One of them, the proposal that the government might release sufficient numbers of female prisoners such that they could empty out one or more of their prisons and use them to accommodate men to alleviate overcrowding in other establishments. I mean, in principle, we would support any measure that decarcerated women in prison. We all recognise they're among the most vulnerable people in society, and they typically will pose very, very little serious risk of harm to the public. The other idea was that the new government would very quickly reintroduce legislation to provide a statutory presumption against short sentences. That was a measure in the previous government's sentencing bill. Seemed to be ruled out last night that would happen immediately, and instead the government are planning a more comprehensive sentencing review, and I think that would form part of that, which Andrew will talk about in a bit more detail. So short-term measures definitely can work to alleviate some of the pressures in overcrowding, but we certainly can't stop there. And even the former Lord Chancellor Alex Chalk has gone on the record to say that planned early release measures will give 18 months at most. So Andrew's going to come on to talk about some of the more bold, creative policy ideas that we think our government would do well to take on board. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I mean, as we've heard, there seems to be a fair wind for some immediate capacity issues to be addressed. It is worth just stressing again that the fact that the last government did effectively kick the can down the road to whoever won the election on July the 4th. And it's certainly true the new administration has the majority and the mandate to take more certain action than Alex Chalk seemed able to. And anyone who did hear him on the Today podcast will know that his views do not reflect what he was able or allowed to do by his Prime Minister. But the refusal ultimately to address these issues also meant that the new government is inheriting a prison system which Sir Keir Starmer was right to call broken at his first press conference last weekend. It's not something that I would recommend campaigners say ordinarily because we need to offer solutions, but it was absolutely the right thing for the Prime Minister to say, to emphasise to the public how serious the situation was. Not only are we running out of cells so that the courts face the prospect of sentencing people with nowhere for them to go, but overcrowding is contributing to violence, to assaults, self-harm, terrible living conditions, to lack of access to work, education, or training. Anyone who has heard Charlie Taylor in the last few months, read any of his reports, will know how he has spelt this out. Prisons are simply not doing the job intended for them, or indeed prisons don't seem to know what the job intended for them should be. That's why it's so important that the new government is bold and it thinks seriously about what prison is for. And that was something that the Prime Minister referenced at one point in the press conference at the weekend. So we have shared ideas with key people in government, and yesterday we published this, Grasping the Nettle, to kind of make those ideas public ahead of this event. And I stress this isn't a detailed blueprint for reform, but it is a menu of options that the government should be considering, ideas that it should have in mind if it is going to see safe and sustainable change. We've suggested some immediate measures and then outlined what could be explored in the medium to longer term. I'm not going to go through everything we've said in detail. I'm just going to pick out some highlights of the contents of this paper to give everyone a flavour of what's in it. And I'm sure that will leave more time for questions, which everyone will be pleased about. So in the immediate term, Gemma mentioned the shift on automatic early release, or SDS 40, if that is what we are going to call it. That is critical because it buys time to be more strategic. And it is much easier for prisons and probation to plan around than the current ad hoc early release schemes that we've seen. Other short-term measures that we've suggested is expanding the eligibility for suspended sentences, potentially from 2 years to 3. We've just heard from Gemma again about the presumption against short prison sentences. We did say in this paper it should be an immediate measure, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We need changes to recall, for example, abolishing recall for administrative reasons, or at the very least, if the government won't do that, dramatically reducing the use of recall in these circumstances, limiting it to a fixed term of 14 days. We need to see an expansion of the use of home detention curfew, as was legislated for in the Victims and Prisoners Act. A greater use of executive release could also be embraced by government. The trend on executive release has gone dramatically downwards in recent years. We make a number of recommendations on the use of remand, given it is at its highest level in 50 years, and reducing the use of remand has to be an immediate priority. In the medium term, as Gemma flagged, the new government has committed in its manifesto to a sentencing review, and we do want to see that a comprehensive review of sentencing and sanctions, looking at reversing the trend of sentencing inflation. We'd argue, as I just said, that actually moving on short sentences doesn't require a root and branch sentencing review. Tackling the question of longer sentences might need more time and consideration, but let's see what exactly shakes out from government announcements over the next week. We need to see further change on the IPP sentence and on the application of joint enterprise doctrine, as Andrea mentioned. We don't go into detail on that in this paper because I think those are issues that this paper is very much framed with the immediate capacity crisis in mind, but we do flag these are long-term injustices that need to be addressed. Gemma also mentioned women in prison. The government should go back to a landmark report from the last Labour administration, which is the Corston report, which said that custodial sentences for women must be reserved for those women who commit serious and violent offences who pose a threat to the public. We make a number of suggestions around sentence progression, on increasing routes out of custody. Sorry, I'm just referring to the document. On increasing routes out of custody for those serving long prison sentences, for improvements on release and reintegration planning. Prison sentences also need to be humanised as much as they can be to provide autonomy and prepare people for safe release. Finally, we make a range of recommendations on wider changes to the criminal justice system. The key one to emphasise here is the real need for investment and reform in probation. We need to see probation go back to a much more localised structure and for it to have independence from the prison service. If there's any argument for government not moving more quickly on some of our recommendations, such as the use of short prison sentences, then it is this question of whether probation is ready and able to do the job that will then be asked of it. Labour really needs to champion the probation service and its vital role in public safety. And on that point about localising probation, there is an opportunity to reconsider a policy concept called justice reinvestment. That is probably a topic for a whole separate webinar and a separate publication from us. But if the government wants to really change things for the better and in a sustainable way, then there are some important reports that were published more than a decade ago, which could be revisited. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Andrew. The final speaker is not actually here, which is our members. So when the dissolution was announced, and obviously the period of sensitivity in advance of the election, PERDA, was announced, and we wrote to our members in prison, amongst other things, asking them what they thought Labour should, well, what they thought the incoming government, not Labour at the time, what they thought the incoming government should do about prisons and what they needed to think about and prioritise. And so I thought we would share some of their views. Katie, you're going to... Do you... Oh, can I go through this? Let me see. No, there we go. So what did our members in prison say? I mean, there was a lot of the feedback was about bang up, like the degree to which people are just locked up in their cells all the time and the overcrowding. So this is one of the first comments about that, tackling the prison system, long periods of locked up and overcrowded prisons affecting access to programs and family contact. We also had a good number of people comment on sentence inflation, so reversing sentence inflation to pivot away from prison as the solution, standing up to pressures to be ever more draconian, not being afraid to reform constructive things for the risk of being written up as soft. Next slide. This is one of our female members who's serving a short sentence, talking about short sentences for women and the destruction of them. Obviously, the previous government has been mentioned, had abolition of short sentences in the draft sentencing bill that has fallen. We're told that that's going to be as part of a new review of sentencing from the new government. But this is a constant kind of refrain we get from women in prison, not just about themselves. In fact, I think this woman is actually not on a short sentence herself, but sees women coming into the prison who just simply should not be in prison and could be better served in the community. This is that big question that we come across a lot, and a lot of people write to us about, is what rehabilitation really means, and the extent to which punishing people and locking them up for long periods of time actually is in any way consistent with rehabilitating people, and that idea of needing to reintegrate prisoners back, ex-offenders back into society in a structured and supported way. Another call for the government to step back from the tough on crime rhetoric, and I think the last week has shown some willingness to balance that out. Again, the importance of the whole community, reducing reoffending through improved probation and rehabilitation, meaningful education and training so people can be released with a living, receiving effective support from probation services, resettlement, reintegration, and that being a good use of public funds and see benefits for the public. Reference to Scandinavia, and more effective sentencing regimes, and the pointlessness, having been up to a life of prison with a lot of lifers yesterday, there is just this huge pointlessness, in my view, of these super long sentences. And this person suggesting that if it's 20 or 20, 45 years, if you can't rehabilitate someone in 20 years, 45 is slim. And the truth is that men I was with yesterday, a lot of them are just going to be rotting for the next 10 or 15 years, while they could be productive in the community. Perhaps more than, I've mentioned this before, more than any other single thing that our members write to us about, we get letters about the IPP sentence, most often from people who are not themselves IPPs, but just who see the injustice of IPPs. So obvious action needing to deal with the IPPs, resentencing, but also support from probation, and saying that if the government is ever to grasp the nettle, which we have stolen from him for our own publication, it should surely be one soon after being elected. So thank you, Simon, for that. And then along with the IPPs, the two strikers who are people on a pre-IPP tariff, effectively, who find themselves in the same problems with the probation board and with recall, and dealing with licenses. Finally, joint enterprise. There, obviously, the Jogee decision talked about a wrong turn. However, only one person has since been released. And drawn to my attention yesterday, understandably, but there's been one person released, and he is one of the few people in prison who's there as a white person on joint enterprise. So no, yet to have any black people on joint enterprise released post-Jogee, despite huge numbers of them. So that's some of our feedback from people in prison. We're very thankful to them. I think for me, the saddest of the letters said, I think you should tell the government to invest in education and in health, and then listed off other things in the community, and then said, and I really would be grateful if you deal with the IPP sentence, because I don't want to die in prison. We're really grateful to our members in prison for sharing their views with us. And obviously, they feed very much into our priorities. So we have already 12 questions with half an hour to go. I think the first of those questions was about the PowerPoints. We don't really have PowerPoints for this. Interested to know how you feel about James Timpson as Prisons Minister. Anyone want to answer that?
I'd be happy to. I mean, I think you said it in your introduction, Andrea, that I think as both because of his background and his commitment to reform and his belief in rehabilitation rather than punishment, I think that it's right that we feel a sense of hope and optimism in terms of the new administration, because I think that there's a symbolism in the fact that that's who they've chosen to appoint as Prisons Minister. I think that the reality of the situation, it's very difficult. And I think we can be optimistic, but I think we also have to be realistic and pragmatic about what's to come. And I think we're all capable of that. So I'm glad. I think as a symbol of reform, and in fact, substantively, because of what I think we know from his past that he believes in, I think it's a really positive, he's a really positive appointment. But we won't be carried away, I think it would be fair to say.
No, I mean, I think I've been at this job for 2.5 years now, and James Timpson is going to be the 6th prison minister in that time. So for the last government, I met 5 different prisons ministers. There was one who was in for a very short period of time, a couple who were in for a bit longer. And every time they needed to take months and months to go on their first prison visit, to start to understand who was in prison, to get to stop being, I mean, in some cases, they were quite frightened about the idea of people in prison. I remember one of them sort of saying, I've not really had anything to do with people in prison before, and now I find myself prisons minister. And so in James Timpson, we do not have that problem. He is somebody who has been going in and out of prisons for 20 years and understands the potential of people in prison, and has put his money and his business where his mouth is. So I think we have reason to be cautiously optimistic, although head not turned, as Gemma said. Andrew, I wonder if there's a question here about probation resets. Do you have?
I mean, it's not irrelevant. It was important that it happened when it happened. What will happen now remains to be seen. NAPWL put a press release out and are in talks today, as we understand, with the Ministry of Justice about what prison reform will mean for probation, and I'm sure they'll be arguing vociferously that it needs more than just the scheme that probation reset represented.
I mean, I think it might be sort of worth noting that I think that, as you've said, Andrew, that was a sort of a fixed period. There was a 9-week implementation phase, and it was up by the 1st of July. So I don't think there'd have to be a new initiative to unwind it, if that makes sense. So I don't think there's obviously lots of change to come, or at least hopefully lots of positive change to come in terms of the relationship with probation and what that will mean. But I'm not sure there's any suggestion that that's going to be unpicked. The change that's gone through.
There's a question here from Cheryl that I think is kind of related, talking about I'd like to hear about the early release scheme. Will it be scrapped? It's causing people to leave prison homeless and without support. I mean, we definitely know that the latter is true. That the way it was rolled out, which was, I mean, really a last-ditch emergency, stressed out, 18 days, 30 days, 70 days, and putting unbearable pressure, I think, on resettlement services in lots of prisons across the country, who felt very uncomfortable, having spoken to lots of them over the last sort of 6 months, felt very uncomfortable having to release certain people, even though they were eligible for release, but really setting people up to fail. I mean, in terms of what we know about what's going to happen, I think it's going to be maintained for the time being until there can be the new SR40 or whatever Jim was talking about. STS40. So at which stage there'll need to be, and that won't be able, it's not for us to come up with a blueprint for how that would be operationalized. But one would imagine that there would have to be some kind of transition period from one system to the other system. I'm afraid at this stage, I certainly don't have any more detail on that. I'm not sure if Andrew or Gemma have any greater insight. Nope. Oh gosh, all the questions have started to come in. There was a question here about from Justin about drugs in prison. Obviously a big issue in some prisons. We're concerned about supply of drugs. We are perhaps more concerned about demand for drugs. And you just need to look at those prisons which have got particular problems. So there was one a few months ago. Oh, which one was it? South Coast, small CCAT male prison, where 52% of people were testing positive for drugs in randomized tests, and it just happened to be a prison where there was absolutely no regime. People were locked up all the time, and you need the government's own, MOJ's own prison strategy, as you may know, sets out the need for purposeful activity and engagement in order to stop the demand for drugs. That when you've just got people locked up in their cells completely idle, that is when they will turn to drugs. I mean, interestingly, in that prison's case, I think 30% of people went into prison having experience of drugs, and yet at the time of the randomized test, 50% of people. So people were picking up drugs, taking drugs while they're in prison who weren't previously. But I think it is definitely, no doubt, an issue for the incoming government because of all of the other impacts it has on regime and on mental health of people and levels of engagement, on self-harm, suicide rates, all of those things. It was Hindley. Thank you, Rob. So yeah, it was Hindley prison. So it will have to be something that's on the radar of the incoming government. But again, if the population can come down by some degree, that would hopefully ease at least a little of that demand pressure, and then allow officers, prison officers, the time and space to do some of the more stopping supply of drugs and being able to dedicate their time to that. And the Hindley report talks about how staff just did not have the bandwidth to be able to stop getting drugs into certain parts of the prison. Other questions? Oh, this technical question here from Bill Davis about operational capacity. I know this is one of Gemma's true loves.
Yes, it is, strangely. So we talk about overcrowding, and I think sometimes can get a bit bogged down in what it means to be overcrowded as a technical matter versus what the reality of the situation is for prisons and for people in them. I think to answer your question specifically, baseline certified normal accommodation is what the prison service says is safe and decent for people. So that would be before you take into account people being crammed into cells built for one. Operational capacity would include doubling up of cells. So when people talk about operational capacity, they are talking about basically the capacity that you can, the number of people you can fit in and keep prisons secure and safe, but certainly not decent. And it's not even the level of sort of decency that the prison system aspire to with CNA. I do think that sometimes we do get too bogged down in that, and what it doesn't reflect is the fact that we have cells that are certified as being fit for human habitation, as you allude to, Bill, that are simply not. And as something that we've been looking at as a legal team in particular, how can you have this disconnect between a system that certifies a cell at, let's say, Bedford in the segregation unit as being fit for use when you have an HMIP report that describes it as a squalid dungeon? There's a disconnect there that I think really needs to be explored. We have cells across the estate that are simply not fit for purpose. And that's something that I think we need to dig into. And I think it's important to remember that, because although we're talking about measures, and I'm glad we're talking about measures that will relieve this immediate population crisis, even when we take a significant number of people out the prison estate, which will hopefully be happening, we are still left with this dilapidated, under-resourced system where cells they're not being refreshed, or they're not being fixed at the moment, and many of them are just, I think that there's been an acceptance of a standards level that actually just isn't good enough, and that's something I think we need to keep on challenging as well.
Right. Other questions here? There's one question here from Jonathan. Andrew, have you read that question? It's hard to read and listen and talk at the same time. I think this is about that balance of dealing with immediate pressures, medium-term kind of reform, and then societal change. I mean, it's definitely the case that the Howard League we try to do all of those things, and Grasping the Nettle does set out immediate, medium, and longer-term kind of questions for the government, because there are some fundamental questions around how they present, how they talk about people in prison, and the extent to which people in prison are able to be part of the citizenry and are kind of connected to society. It's very interesting, like the newspaper articles overnight talking about, the call for, which has been a call made by the previous government as well, to, employ more people from prison, when there have been kind of considerable efforts to kind of dehumanize people in prison for some period of time, and yet we're meant to be like all embracing them as employers. So I think there are some bigger questions around how government talks about people in prison to the wider community and in politics, and we've seen a little bit of that from Labor so far. But that's where I think we require our politicians to have the courage to lead the society in kind of understanding people in prison and what prison can and can't do. So I hope that goes some way to answer your question, Jonathan. Gillian, who is from is a hero of the Wandsworth Prison Improvement Campaign, along with a couple of other people who are on this meeting today, has asked a question about: do we support the idea that government should prioritise tackling the worst prisons first? I'm not sure. We definitely don't have a policy position on that. Andrew, is this something we've thought about?
I think part of the problem actually has been that is what the previous government was. I mean, it was doing it very badly, but there was a piecemeal approach to responding to inspection reports and urgent notifications from the chief inspector. As things got worse and worse, the ability to respond to those urgent notifications became weaker and weaker, to the point that I think Charlie Taylor must have felt he was ringing an alarm bell without a clapper in it. So no, I think we need to see system-wide change. I mean, obviously there are, I say that there are incremental steps that will take place, and there will be decisions about resources that will benefit some prisons immediately, perhaps before others. And you can absolutely see why a prison like Wandsworth, given the state that it's in, might receive extra attention quicker or whatever. But I think it's system-wide change and thinking about the system as a whole, rather than talking about failing institutions and relying just on institutional inspections, is really required.
At the same time, we are using our legal function to pick up on those kind of worst bits of worst prisons. Maybe Gemma, you could speak to that briefly.
Well, I was just going to say, I do think that, as Andrew said, the failure to be able to respond to those very worst conditions, because there's just simply no room in the system to do so, has been really detrimental. And I think we can see with, so for example, the turnaround of HMP Liverpool, which actually involved removing, almost half the population, so several hundred men. And without doing that, it wasn't going to be possible to turn around that prison. But at the moment, you have, 5 prisons in UN, Cookham Wood's now shut. And there is no way to remove a large group of men from those prisons whilst you try to turn them around. And so I do think that creating more space in the system will allow for a focus on those prisons where things are particularly bad. And as you say, Andrea, it's certainly not something that we are resting on our laurels with. We're looking at the conditions in those worst places and seeing where there is potential for litigation, to hold to account the failure to make them better. And I think we've seen the potential power of that. So for example, with Bedford, the date, we saw it went into urgent notification, and we were particularly struck by the descriptions of the conditions in the segregation unit, as I've alluded to. And we have engaged in legal correspondence to try to hold previous government to account, for its action plan, where it had been promising for several years that it would close the segregation unit and open a new one. So I think we can see the power of litigation when, as a stick, when the carrot of doing the right thing has not been sufficient. So yeah, we'll keep on with that for sure.
I'm afraid we've now got so many questions. There's no way we're possibly going to get through them all in this period of time. So I'm going to have to quickly pick and choose. Just to clarify, the IPP sentences are not still being handed out, but people on IPP sentences remain in prison. About 1,300 of them have never been released, despite the fact that the vast majority, all but I think 13, 15, have actually passed their tariff. And then there are about another 1,600, so 1,700 people who have been released by the parole board into the community and have been recalled to prison and are in prison awaiting to be re-released by the parole board. So it's not like the IPP sentences are still being handed out, but because it was never retrospectively abolished, probably rightly so, it means we still live with the consequences of that. Andrew's going to answer Rob Allen's question around the Home Office.
Yes, I'm a former civil servant, and so is Rob. So this might be boring for people. We didn't hard recommend this, but we did float as an option changes to the machinery of government. And one of those ideas was that actually the Ministry of Justice has been a mistake. And the reason I would argue that, and I know Rob's position is that the Home Office is an illiberal pit of sin, and he may well be right. The reason that we at least float that idea is because I do think there is a problem with the division of responsibility and then consequences. So in essence, you've got a Home Secretary who is responsible for cutting crime, but they're not responsible for the consequences of the policies that they use to do so. And for example, what that does to the prison population. So to absolutely encapsulate that, I remember Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, at a Conservative Party conference, joking that she locks them up and Ken Clarke lets them out. And I think that is dysfunctional. I mean, Jonathan mentioned diversion in his questions. Well, there's a topic, a policy area, which the Ministry of Justice has actually not that much sway over, because the most meaningful diversion is at the police stage. So that's the argument. And the other thing is the Ministry of Justice is still seen as a newbie on the block by some of the big departments. And it has struggled to get the cross-government buy-in required to promote those policies that keep people out of the criminal justice system. But it's an idea. It's not something that we hard recommend. I do think one of the promising things so far about the new Labour government is that, for example, David Hanson, a former prisons minister and a long-term member of the Justice Select Committee, is actually now at the Home Office. And there are some signs that the Home Office and the MOJ are absolutely, at least at this stage, in lockstep, possibly because the Prime Minister has put his imprimatur behind prison reform.
There are a few questions here about different kind of groups of prisoners. One is older prisoners. There are about 6,000 people who are over 60 in the prison estate, and still thousands who are over 70. I was in a prison recently where there was a man who was 77 and just been given a 20-year sentence. So he would be, and another prison where there was a 98-year-old in their prison. So we do have a very aging prison population. It is certainly something that we will be talking to HMPPS about, because I think we need to come up with another alternative for people who are elderly and incapacitated, to house them in another possibly secure setting or just suspend sentences. But that is definitely, I think, on the radar of government. I think anything that would involve taking people out of the system probably is going to be on the radar of government. In terms of the question from WIP, from Women in Prison, we don't yet know what's going to happen with the female offender strategy. Certainly in our discussions with Labour frontbench while they were in opposition, there was a high level of interest in women, and a lot of sympathy for women in prison and the position they find themselves in. We know from their own delivery strategy that 90% of women in prison don't pose a general risk to the public, and there's going back to the Corsten report that Andrew mentioned, never been such like a stronger evidence base for anything than there is on sort of dealing differently with women in prison. So I am hopeful that women in prison will be a priority. There's also a question here about children. While I think the immediate crisis is obviously focused on the adult, particularly male estate, again, prior conversations with Labour before the election, there was real interest from them about the children's estate, and about the state of youth justice. So I think I don't think there's any question of children falling off the radar. I do privately, now publicly, worry that a kind of return to talk of antisocial behaviour orders might see greater criminalisation of younger people, and as well as people who are mentally unwell, and that might risk the danger of driving up numbers of children in prison, which we absolutely don't want to see. And obviously, it is children in prison remain a huge priority for the Howard League. We're having to rethink some of our cases and strategies, but there is undoubtedly were ways in which children fell off the agenda with the last government, particularly girls, obviously. Other questions that Gemma and Andrew would like to answer, given the zillion questions?
I see Joe Sims' question. Well, it's not a question, it's a comment. It's an important comment, which is that prisons have been in crisis for decades. Well, yeah, forever, perhaps. I mean, prisons are crisis personified. I mean, of course, that is correct. But at the same time, politically, there is no doubt that the capacity crisis, rather than the prisons crisis, has forced this government's hand, as it should have forced the last government's hand if it had political strength to do something about it. And I think that is the difference. And I go back to what I said about, I mean, I think the problem we have with talking to the public is there is such a thing as crisis fatigue. If you talk about crisis all the time, they stop listening. And I think that was a problem for the prison reform sector. It talked about crisis for years because it was a crisis, but it just flatlined, it drowned out, it wasn't working. And similarly, I think if saying the prison system is broken wasn't working, but it's very different when the Prime Minister says it. That has cut through, and allied then to a language of we're going to try and fix it, is important. But I take the point, and I doubt this government is going to go as far as Joe would like from an abolitionist perspective.
There's a couple of questions in there that I'd love to speak to briefly, if that's okay. So the one from Susie Nicholson, which talks about inspectors and how inspectors sort of make reports about the state of prison, but there isn't any obligation for that to be acted on. They just provide the information, they sound the alarm, but there isn't really any accountability process for what they do next. And I think that's something that we've been lamenting too at the Howard League, that we'll read an urgent notification, we'll read the action plan that government are mandated to produce afterwards, but once it's been produced, there is no accountability measure beyond being held to account in Parliament for a failure to do something that you've said you will do. Short of potential litigation. So it is something that we've been exploring, and it was something, for example, again, to bring up Bedford, that we looked at. You know, there were promises made in multiple action plans, and so it was fruitful to go back and say, you have acknowledged through your action plan that you need to take action, but you've not done it. And that, as a sort of course of conduct, doesn't seem to be advisable, if possibly lawful. So I think that there is a gap there in accountability. Do I think that's something the new government will act upon? Well, I'd love to think so, but no, probably not. I think it would be hard to imagine them introducing a new measure by which they could be held to account in that way. Unfortunately, I don't know if Andrew disagree with that, but certainly those of us who are reading, you know, inspectorate reports and trying to hold to account, I think we'll continue to do so. The other one was actually just above, from Cameron Smith, who asked about sort of meaningful activity, and do we think a digital approach to education is the correct step for the future? And it's something that I've been sort of grappling with in the context of children in particular, who are entitled to receive education from a legal perspective, and they have access to laptops in the children's estate. And would it be a good thing for their education to be provided on those laptops? And whilst on the one hand, I think obviously expanding people's access to educational resources should only be a good thing, I do think that there is a concern on the other that it might become a replacement for meaningful time out of cell and interaction with other people, and all the enrichment that you get from being in an environment where you're learning, not just from having access to those resources. And so I think that's certainly, from a children's perspective, something that I've been worried about. I think as an add-on, great. As a replacement, not so good. I think digital access just in prisons generally is really important, and we've seen a very slow piecemeal introduction of laptops into the adults' estate. And I think the faster that can be done, the better, because I do think, you know, having access to a myriad of things online is really valuable and will help everybody. So hopefully the new government will find a way to prioritise that.
Thanks, Gemma. Andrew, are you happy to answer Nick Hardwick's question, which is a long question? Sorry.
Yeah, it's partly a comment and then a question. I'll read out that, just in case people can't see it in the chat, because there are a lot of things there now. But Nick says, machinery and government questions are important. Back to the Home Office is one option, or should local government and mayors have more responsibility? What about taking day-to-day control out of politicians' hands and returning to a modern version of prison commissioners abolished in the 1960s? Not sure about any of these, but they do need thinking about. Nick and I spoke about this at an event last week. the prison commissioner's idea, and I have thought about it, which is why I have kind of a prepared answer. I didn't know he would be here and ask that question. Ian Loader, Professor Ian Loader of Oxford University, wrote a very important article in the British Journal of Criminology in 2005-06 called "Fall of the Platonic Guardians," and it was basically saying that populism, and I don't mean Trumpian levels of populism, but political populism meant that you couldn't really have the old kind of patrician civil servants running the rule over public policy in quite the way that they did in the early 20th century and up into the middle of the 20th century. And the prison commissioner model is perhaps a little bit the Platonic guardian. Why is it called Platonic guardian? I assume because Plato, being a philosopher, believed everything should be run by philosophers. But I do think the idea about local government is something that should be seriously considered, and that is part of the concept of justice reinvestment, which is and it is happening to a degree with the metro mayors. I mean, there is some devolution of justice budgets to Manchester or London, but prisons is not part of that devolved budget. Well, maybe it should be, and maybe they can make decisions about taking money out of prisons and spending it in the community and cutting crime far more effectively that way.
Just very quickly trying to answer a couple of other questions. I mean, Bev's asked some questions around, how do you fund all of this? I think it's worth noting just how expensive prison is. So, a fair bit of what we're proposing could be funded by money not being spent on building £4 billion worth of new prisons and the years of billions of pounds of ongoing costs with that. So prison is an extremely expensive way to achieve nothing when it comes to reduction of crime. So we would see that being a possibility. A couple of questions around private prisons. There is this kind of prison, it's a sort of conspiracy theory about private prisons and recall. I'm not aware of any evidence that suggests that that is the case at all, but it is something I think that has captured the imagination of certain people in prison, including some of our members. So I'm not sure that that's true. It remains to be seen how the new government will deal with private prison providers and the contracts that are coming up for new prisons, and whether they go into the public or the private sphere, and that's a wait and see kind of moment. I don't think we probably have time for really any more of your questions, but we will go through them and think about them in the context of the next few weeks and responding to developments and thinking about how we deal with with the new government. I do note that there's a question here around support for people with ADHD, autism and dyslexia. I mean, this is again something that we see in our casework with young people, but also in our membership. It's something that's consistently raised, and we are looking at things like the sentencing of people with who are on the spectrum, because we're concerned that there are problems with sentencing approaches, and that is very front of mind. Ditto issues of recall and homelessness and all of those sort of things, and providing better support. The idea of buddies coming out of prison, I think, is a really good one. I'm not sure if that's been explored. But thank you all very much for your comments and your questions. I'm sorry that we've run out of time. My great thanks to Andrew and to Gemma for coming along today. I think this is an exciting time where there feels like there's considerably more hope than there has been in the time I've been at the Howard League. And frankly, since I've been in this sort of sector for nearly, I don't know how many years now, 15 years, it has been hard to find a Prime Minister who would talk about prisons in any way that wasn't kind of revolting and insulting. And to have a Prime Minister now who is speaking about the purpose of prison and is talking about diversion of people away from the criminal justice system, I think it is an encouraging start. I do not imagine that we are going to agree with everything or even many things that the new government will be proposing over time. And any of these emergency kind of measures or urgent measures to deal with capacity problems is not going to immediately sort of solve the daily struggles and injustices suffered by people in our prison system. So we will continue to monitor and to challenge, provide scrutiny and hold the government to account on all of those things. So please be assured of that, and we will be in touch soon. So thank you very much. If you're not a member of the Howard League, please join. And Katie's put links in there. So thank you all very, very much. And I know many of you are working in this sector, so go well and keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.